Hi, this is Colin Sanders and this is the History Books Review, and tonight I'm reviewing Advice to Young Men by William Cobbett, or to give it its full title, Advice to Young Men and, incidentally, to young women in the middle and higher ranks of life in a series of letters addressed to a youth, a bachelor, a lover, a husband, a father and a citizen or subject. Well, quite a title. William Cobbett seems to be out of fashion at the moment. He went through a brief spell of fashionability back in the 1980s, which is when this book was somewhat surprisingly republished. I don't think it's in print anymore, and it's certainly not one of the well-known William Cobbett works, and indeed probably only Rural Rides nowadays is. Like a lot of Cobbett's work, really what you're reading about is Cobbett. And this is never truer than in Advice to Young Men. At least in Rural Rides you do get the backdrop of the political situation of his day. In something like Cottage Economy you read about how to run a farm and raise rabbits and so on and so forth. But in Advice to Young Men, basically it is a disguised biography of the man himself, and it really is about as self-indulgent as William Cobbett gets, and if you've read any William Cobbett you'll realise that that is very self-indulgent. Having said that, I read it and instantly went back to the beginning and read it again when I actually was a young man when it first came out, and although not much of the advice stands up, there is something about it which sort of compels you to pay attention. Cobbett is a very moral person, a much more moral person than most of us either could be or really would even want to be. And you sort of feel yourself in the company of someone who's perhaps just a few rungs up above you, and that's quite a good thing to experience from time to time. The other thing that makes this book interesting is I think it is in many ways one of the world's first self-help books. Cobbett advises us to get up early, to study assiduously, and has such helpful tips such as to make sure you marry a pretty woman. The reason for this being not the obvious one you might imagine, but that a pretty woman has fewer temptations to stray because she can have the pick of who she likes, whereas if you marry an unattractive woman then she will be marrying you because she's desperate and therefore is open to other people's offers. I'm not sure how the psychology of that one works, and I wouldn't advise it as a sensible course of action. But one piece of advice is very useful, and this comes towards the end of the book in the section addressed to a citizen, which is to make your mission in life to support the poor and the oppressed against the rich and the powerful. His point again is perhaps not the most obvious of ones for such a proposal. It is that the rich and the powerful will always have plenty of people to look after them and to argue their case, and therefore it is a more honourable and noble path to speak out for the less well off. Again, that's not the motivation many modern reformers would claim, but perhaps, despite the slightly bizarre logic behind it, it does sort of make sense. After all, why do we do anything? And isn't perhaps aspiring to a greater character than we would otherwise possess? Maybe that is a valid objective rather than the inherent justice of what we might be striving for. I'm going to end this very short review by following some of the advice actually given by William Cobbett in the book. In fact, it's the very first sentence of the introduction he wrote to it, which reads, "It is the duty and ought to be the pleasure of age and experience to warn and instruct youth and to come to the aid of inexperience." Stirring stuff. And the opportunity has arisen just on this very day to put that advice into practice. The front page of the Daily Mail today runs on a story which goes that modern youth are incapable of succeeding because they don't have the necessary grit. The story is made to stand up by quoting an illustrious figure, a gentleman called Nicholas Hurd. I've never heard of this guy before today, but he apparently is the son of Douglas Hurd, a former Foreign Secretary, a man who I actually have some admiration for. I've no idea what Nick Hurd himself is like, and given that this is the Daily Mail, he might very well have had his words taken completely out of context and distorted to give them a message that he himself never intended. So the people I am talking about here are definitely the editorial staff of the Daily Mail and not whoever happens to be behind this story. And it illustrates very well one of Cobbett's recurring themes, which is that the rich and the powerful always have people looking out for their interests. And my advice to young people who might have read that story today and perhaps been dismayed for it, when you read it, it sounds very plausible and some statistics are dragged up from somewhere to show that indeed today's youth are in some way inferior to all preceding generations, and that's why they're doing so well. But here's the voice of an older person speaking. When I read that story, this is what I read. There is a big problem with youth unemployment at the moment, and what do the people who are in charge of the country want to do? They want to blame the unemployed themselves. They don't want to take responsibility for running the country. This blaming the victim is always an unappealing and unpleasant thing to see, but when you see it being put into practice by a large corporation, as the Daily Mail is, one with an atrocious track record. They used to support the fascists. They blamed the Labour Party for being funded by the communists in the 1930s. Even recently they've run on the bandwagon to get people to be scared of the MMR vaccine, which may well have led to some babies dying of measles. It really is a disgusting organ, and it's a great shame that anybody buys it, and even greater shame that those of us who don't buy it nor read it are obliged to pass the headlines it deigns to put on the front cover when we're in the shops going about our normal business trying to buy groceries. So I know some young people today are no better and no worse than young people have ever been. Young people are always a bit clueless because they haven't had the length of time that us who've been around longer have to spot things. So they are a bit credulous, a bit gormless, and unfortunately quite likely to be upset by this kind of rubbish that the Daily Mail is printing on its front pages. So, to follow Cobbett's words, I will come to the aid of inexperience. As you get older, you will see through these things much easier and will realise that you can't trust what the tabloids say about anything ever, and this doesn't just apply to the political coverage, it goes across the board. All social issues are twisted into a dialogue that suits the interests of the people who are in charge. And B, people are pretty much the same wherever you go, and the older people who were around you at one stage were young and just as dozy and clueless as you are now, and the only cure for that is to carry on living and to do your best to keep your wits about you. And that's my advice to young men and young women, and I hope you find it of some value. And no doubt in another 20 years' time I'll look back on people of my age and think I wish I knew then what I know now. I wish I knew when I was in my late teens and early 20s what I know now. And if I can speed up your process of learning, then I will have spent the short time I spent on this podcast productively. Thanks for listening.